Okay, so today we're going to start actually learning about some of the diagramming that will help us build up to some of the simulation modeling frameworks that we talked about in the introduction. So just to kind of get motivated into that, this is a news article, I think, from 2021. This was back when things were starting to pick back up from COVID-19. And there was this question of, are we experiencing a so-called K-shaped recovery up here? Now, when we talk about this term K-shaped recovery, that's effectively a graphical model about the way in which a society might recover from a pandemic or some other event. And so what does it mean to be a K-shaped recovery? Well, to see what that means sort of on a graph, then the idea here is that if you've got a time event down here, so you've got a time before time, an event, which is kind of this transition region, and then an after time, then a K-shaped recovery represents when two groups of a population decline together, but then after a recovery, one group takes off and the other group does not. And so in this particular case, then they talk about that, technology, retail, software services is this purple line up here, and the industries needing assistance are travel, entertainment, hospitality, food services. They continue to decline, and it kind of looks like a K. So it is a graphical communication of particular trajectory that might happen in such a scenario. And the question was, are we in a K-shaped recovery from COVID? And so I bring this up because then you can also ask, well, okay, that's fine, that describes it, but what are the causes? What's behind a K-shaped recovery? And you can look up K-shaped recovery on various business sites or whatever, and they'll give you all these possible things that could go into what K-shaped recovery is. But then they say down here, that note that these three things that they've identified up here might not be mutually exclusive. All three might be at play in a given K-shaped recovery, along with other factors. So in other words, it's really complex what's going on here. And in order to really get at, experimenting with which drivers are in effect in which, recoveries, then we would like to have more than just a graphical description. We would like to have some sort of dynamical model that we could maybe play with by turning off certain things, turning on others, and seeing if we get the same sort of recovery, that sort of thing. So the question is, how do we move toward dynamical models that allow us to introduce possible causes so that we can compare scenario trajectories in the simulated world with hypothetical causes with the real world, so we can maybe get some idea as to what might be going on in the real trajectories. And so that's kind of where we're moving here, is how do we get to something more than just a graphical description? How do we start investigating causes, the hypothetical causes? And that's what kind of brought us to tools like last time. Now, we are building up to learning how to build stock and flow models. So chapter 1 in Moorcroft was really giving you an idea of where you're going. It's not, I'm not expecting you to immediately understand everything that has to do with stock and flow models. This is what we're going to start with, causal diagrams today, and gradually build up into stock and flow models, but this is what we're going towards. And so this is the goal, a stock and flow model. And the idea behind the stock and flow model is that dynamical variables in a system, these are things that are changing over time, and we call those stocks, and they represent a state of a system. And so a stock could be the number of fish in a fishery. It could also be the average income of a particular group of people. These are things that we can think of that at any instant of time is static, but from instant to instant could fluctuate. And we could imagine that there would be certain causal drivers that could lead to that cause these state variables to move around from one state to another. And those causal drivers we refer to as flows. And so if we have a bunch of stocks, then we can say that this one particular stock, let's say call it interest rate or whatever, it has an effect on flows which change other stocks. So you can create this like intercoupled network, once you have these sorts of things. And when you're building these diagrams, what you're actually building behind the scenes is this mathematical expression down here, which is just the rate of change of the stock over time is equal to the inflows minus the outflows. So as we learn how to build stock and flow diagrams, which we haven't done yet, but as we will learn how to do that, we will learn how to put formulas, simple algebraic formulas, expressions in the inflows and in the outflows that are functions of other stocks in the system. And as we draw these diagrams, what we'll actually be doing is writing this math. So when we hit, what will actually happen when the simulation plays our stock and flow model is it will be solving this equation. Likewise, if a mathematician were to hand you this equation down here, then you could do the translation process of taking this equation and drawing the graphical version of it in a simulation tool, and then hitting play on the simulation, and that would be a surrogate for actually trying to solve the thing. So that's kind of where we're going. This is what we mean by a dynamical model. It's a mathematical model that captures what we think are the important causal relationships between things so that we can see how they unroll in a way that it's easier for the computer to do than our minds to do. And so this idea that Forrester had that we talked about last time was you can get sort of a core set of the important stocks that you think represent a system. In his case, he said, well, maybe we can get a lot of traction on understanding world dynamics with only, say, these 5 stocks. And we take these stocks and we couple them together with flows, where all these flows are functions of the other stocks. And it looks like a big, ugly mess. But if you really sort of see here, then this combinations of those 5 stocks, where each stock influences the flows of other stocks. And if you have all of that big mess there, hard to reason about it without a computer, but with a computer, then you can generate trajectories. And you can show that under certain conditions, you get collapses. Under other conditions, you get long-term stability. And the point here is that nowhere in the simulation model, nowhere in the computer model, did we introduce an exogenous shock to the system. Nowhere in the model did some giant asteroid or meteor come and hit and cause this collapse. The collapse is explained through these interior features. Now, of course, if something came and hit the Earth, this could happen. We're not saying that those things aren't important, but we're saying how much could we get even without that happening? How much damage could we do by ourselves without worrying about what's coming from outside? So that's what we call the endogenous perspective. And so I will use these terms endogenous and exogenous, which basically have to do with what you're going to put inside your model and what you're going to put outside your model. And the endogenous perspective is that we're going to focus on observable changes in systems that are largely in part that are predictable consequences of things inside the system. And by the way, you guys, in case you haven't seen it, all these slides are online. So if you do ever want to follow along, if you haven't found it under Canvas, you can go to the lectures module, and every lecture you click on it, and it should have the slide embedded right within it. So if you want to follow along, in class or out of class, whatever, it's great if you're taking notes too. But I see a lot of people craning their necks and everything, and that's fine because I think writing things actually does help you memorize it and and process it. But if you're writing it, it's because you don't want to miss it. I just want to let you know these are available, and they're all available pre-available. So you can go and see all the lectures for the rest of the semester if you like. They're all up there already. Okay, so that's the endogenous perspective. So while I'm paused here, any questions on what I mean by that? The endogenous perspective, this idea that observable phenomena are functions of processes inside the system. We're not saying that things outside the system can't make an impact, but we are just studying, for the purpose of these models, what can happen just based on what we know is already in the system. And then we also can do things like, well, let's shock the system and see how well the system adapts to that shock. But this is, right now we're saying at sort of at our first level, what comes from the system. And then the second level, we can say, how robust is the system to change based on what's going on inside. Derwin?
Yeah, so part of the question about what's endogenous versus exogenous is really the question that you're using to define the model in the first place, and where you're arbitrarily drawing the scope lines, right? Because in reality, in a system that has an impact from what you may want to consider as external to your to your
Right.
model.
That's a great point. So the point, the question brought up here, or the comment brought up here, is that it seems like this is sort of, it's an arbitrary distinction between endogenous and exogenous, and in all systems, you're going to have external factors and internal factors, and that's definitely true. The only closed system is the universe as a whole, right? So once you focus on a system, you're necessarily saying, I am going to forget about all the stuff outside the system, just on the insides. But every once in a while, stuff does get flung into the solar system from way outside, and it does matter. And so, in some ways, it is arbitrary, but in other ways, it's about we can have different modeling approaches that focus on the endogenous or the exogenous. So I can say that the price of grain, I can say that is an exogenous factor. Now, what I'm saying is, I am not modeling how the price of grain, other very distinguished factors outside the windows there passing by that were showing how distinguished they are. So I can say, for example, that like the price of grain is, if I were to say price of grain was endogenous, that would mean that I would have to build a model in here that would reflect, that would cause the price of grain to change based on things happening inside the system. Now, I might say, I have no idea why the price of grain changes. So I'm going to make the price of grain a parameter. And if it changes, I'm going to change the parameter as kind of a hand of God coming in on the outside of the model and changing it. And so taking that perspective, saying the price of grain is exogenous to the system means that I can now investigate how changes in the price of grain will affect my world dynamics here. And I can either do that just by static changes, like what if the price of grain is holding static, or I can give it like, what if it rises and it falls really quick and comes back up? I can ask all those what if questions. And if somebody says, well, where are you getting these price of grain things? Well, I can say that's just exogenous. I'm just saying, I'm speculating that this could happen. So when I say endogenous perspective, I could view it as I've got endogenous factors, which are factors that I'm saying their dynamics are explained totally internal, and exogenous factors, I'm saying that they're set outside. And later on in the semester, when we talk about like the fisheries model, like right now, the fishery you saw, you got to set the number of boats going into the fishery. Later on, we'll talk about how we endogenize parameters like that. How do we build a model that tries to approximate human behavior so that we get natural fluctuations in the number of ships that don't require a programmer ahead of time. So we will have the ability. So it just kind of depends on the questions you're trying to ask and the types of analyses you're doing. But what I'm trying to get at here is that once you've made those choices and you've chose to put your parameters in here, then the idea from that point forward is that you're assuming that the really important, exciting, observable changes here are primarily due to the stuff going on inside, or how the stuff going on inside responds to kicks from inputs on the outside. But we sort of assume that the really stuff doesn't happen because it's being forced to do that from the outside. We're assuming that it's coming from something inside the system, if that makes sense. Yeah. So, this is kind of like, so there's a lot of things to talk now about social capital. So that you can say that like where you grow up may give you more of a benefit than you might think. And that's sort of a statement about that there are the internal network of the people that you grew up around have sort of a value that's just as good as someone, if you didn't live in the area, someone were to just give you a bunch of money. So it's almost like there's this isomorphism, this kind of fancy word for it. We could say that if you don't have the cash, but you have the right network, it has just as much value as if you didn't have the cash, but then someone like hand of God handed you a wad of cash, it would give you the same benefit. So to say social capital, there's like an equivalence there. So that's what we're saying, is that there's something almost tangible in the network. That's what the endogenous perspective is all about. Are there questions about that or comments? Online too. Okay. So that's the idea is, we're trying to build up to these things, right? And so once we have these things, we can then start trying to understand, once we see these patterns, what parts of this system, what subsystems here are really generating these things, that type of analysis we can do. And so simplifying that, if we go back to the fishery example, we've got this relatively simple stock and flow diagram that we'll learn how to, again, build all these, but the basic idea is you have a population of fish, and based on that population of fish, you can calculate a density, divide fish by carrying capacity. That gives you a way to look up the regeneration. That will change the number of new fish per year, which will then change the number of fish. So notice I kind of went around there. So there's a feedback there where the number of fish affects the number of new fish, which affects the number of fish. And so that feedback is kind of really, the nature of that feedback is locked in this net regeneration block, this curve, which plots density on one axis, on the horizontal axis, and number of new fish per year on the vertical axis. And for densities where it's a relationship, we say that it's a reinforcing or a positive feedback, because as you get more fish, you get a higher regeneration rate, which leads to even more fish and so on. But at high densities, so at low densities, the thought is here is that you need fish to produce more fish, and so if you have more fish, you're going to have even more reproduction. And even the kind of extra slope here at the beginning is this thing like talked about last time, like the Lee effect, where there's a mate availability problem too. Is it so as you have more fish, it's easier for fish to find mates, and so there's even kind of even more of a ramp initially, and then this is just kind of normal exponential growth. But eventually, fish have a hard time finding resources. New fish can't be fed, they die. And so you end up getting a balancing feedback. And so by balancing, it means that as you get closer and closer to carrying capacity, you get fewer and fewer new fish. And the net effect of that is that if you just let this population go, it'll start low, it'll rise up quick, and then it'll level off at the carrying capacity. It's as if the carrying capacity is being regulated. It's like the population is being brought to carrying capacity and then just sit steady at that point. And we're looking at new fish down here, is that you get a ramp up in new fish, but the new fish start to decline. So you have no new fish once you're at carrying capacity right there. And so there's kind of two types of feedbacks. There's an early an early reinforcing and a late balance. And those two together form this S-shaped growth curve. Now that's fine and all, that's a good story once I draw this diagram here, but it's kind of cryptic from the diagram itself. And so it would be nice if we could just look at the diagram without looking at that graph and see that we've got these two feedback loops that are interacting. And so the ideal would be is that rather than have it, so this is our current diagram. When I look at it, I don't see two loops, I just see one feedback loop. And so that is not doesn't tell a good story. So it doesn't communicate well. So if I could redraw this model so that it was clear in the diagram that I had these two loops that were interacting, that would be a better way to draw this model if I can do it in an equivalent way. And it turns out, as we'll learn, that there is a way for me to do that. Rather than having one model all of net regeneration in one little box called net regeneration here, if I, now this might have just been the simplest way to do it because just empirically, it might just be easier to measure net regeneration. But if I have a way to model the effect of population on births separately from the effect of population on death, there's a way for me to break this net regeneration curve up into two separate processes, an inflow and an outflow. And if I do it right, can actually build the exact same model I have from chapter 1 into this one here. But what's nice about this model is you can start seeing that there are two loops here. There's a population birth loop, and there's also a population death loop. And that population birth loop is always reinforcing, and that population death loop is always balancing. So it's not context dependent. I don't need to look at a graph and try to figure out like early and late and whatever. It's clear that I've got these two loops together. And so what we're going to learn how to draw here is this intermediate point, this causal loop diagram, where before I worry about how to build this dynamic model up here with all the math, I pop it out and I draw something that is more refined than just showing the loops. it still represents all of the variables that are probably important, like population is probably important, death rate's probably important, deaths are important, so on. But I just model their qualitative impact on each other. And this is what we're going to learn how to draw today. So roughly speaking, this diagram, as we will learn how to do today, says that if you increase the death rate, you increase the deaths. As you increase the deaths, you decrease population. And if we do this game for every single link, and again, we're going to get to this, we're going to do link by link, we're going to learn how to draw this in the next couple of minutes. But the idea here is if I assemble a bunch of these links, the loops will pop off the page, and then I'll be able to see, aha, I didn't know what type of feedback structure I had, but even before doing the quantitative stuff where I can do predictions about what the curves look like and everything like that, I can see I have a positive feedback loop next to a negative feedback loop. I'm going to expect I'm probably going to get some sort of S-shaped growth out of this, and that's what we're kind of going with here. So this is where we'll start with the causal loop diagram. So start with causal loop diagrams and build up to stock and flow diagrams. Other textbooks do the opposite. They start with stock and flow diagrams, and then they analyze them using causal loop diagrams. And in your career, when you start doing dynamic modeling, you'll do both. So sometimes you're saying, how do I build a model? It's easier to start with thinking about the key causal factors and then building the model up. Other times someone will hand you a model and say, what's going on in this complicated web? And you'll say, okay, well, let's break it down into its causal loop diagram and look for the loops, and then we can analyze it. So you do both in practice, but with stuff, you kind of got to choose one direction first. And the textbook that we use by Moorcroft, he does causal loop diagrams first. Another popular textbook for this type of course by Andy Ford does stock and flow diagrams first. Some students, stock and flow diagrams resonate more with them than CLDs. Other students, CLDs resonate more with them than stock and flow diagrams. There's probably a mixture of those students in this class. I had to pick one way because we don't do one way at a time. We will eventually learn how to do both, but we had to choose one to go first, and so we're doing causal loop diagrams first. If they're not kind of, it's like you really need the dynamics, just wait a couple of lectures and we'll get into the dynamic stuff and everything will kind of come together. But we had to choose one first. It's not that you don't always have to do CLDs first. That's all I'm trying to say. All right, so before we start learning how to draw these things, are there any questions about this roadmap for where we're going forward, or the general idea here, including questions online? And by the way, anybody who's visited this questions link, it was filling up with the service I used because they changed kind of their how they do the structure. And so I switched to a different service. So if you tried this before and it said like, oh, too many people are logged in, then it should now, I think you should be able to get in and post. So it's so that's kind of been fixed, switched services with those. So. Okay, good. All right, so causal loop diagrams. And this is, if you've taken systems thinking, hopefully this is a little bit of a review, but maybe we'll make things a little bit more concrete and give you some tools to better understand these things. And so we're going to talk about the feedback loops and feedback loops. And there are analogous, or there are sort of these totally equivalent terms that will just switch around based on, you know, the context. And so we'll talk about positive feedbacks, but the equivalent term is a reinforcing feedback. Sometimes it's also called a snowball effect. This gets a little bit confusing because the terms vicious and virtuous cycle are both positive feedbacks. For the math, they're identical. Even certainly, if you talk about them, they're very different, but mathematically, they're identical. We'll use notations of a plus with a circle around it or parentheses around it, or an R for reinforcing. We'll use symbols like these, pluses with circles, pluses with directionality around them, or even little diagrams of snowballs are common to see in these types of diagrams, or these things here. So here's another example of a snowball. This is from a different software tool. Sometimes they show a growing exponential growth curve. All of these are identical, and they represent growth processes. These are like, you know, if fish produce more fish, and those generate more fish, which produces more fish. That produces exponential growth, so long as it's not limited. And so that's a positive feedback. A vicious cycle is a positive feedback that we say kind of has qualitatively negative consequences. So a vicious cycle might be that someone has poor health and it makes them depressed, which leads them to engage in activity, which creates them even worse health. And so it's a cycle where they're accumulating sort of these negative influences on their health. But then a virtuous cycle can go the other way, where if you if you have a good study habit and it causes you to do well in your courses and without having to spend as much time, then that might end up making you more positive about the studying because it's not eating up as much of your time. And so you end up kind of doing better and better. So it's this idea in both cases here, you have a growth, an exponential growth, but the context makes vicious and sometimes called virtuous. So it gets confusing then when we talk about negative feedback, because negative feedback, also called balancing feedback or counteracting feedback, sometimes also called a regulatory process or regulating feedback. Notations here, negative sign with a circle or parentheses around it, B with a circle or parentheses, or C for counteracting, same thing. Sometimes scales are used. Here's scales in one software program, here's scales in another. Sometimes it looks like a decaying exponential. That's a symbol that's used. All these things are equivalent for negative feedback. And these are feedbacks where the larger the thing gets, the more likely it is to get smaller in the immediate future. And so it has this effect where it causes itself to shrink or causes itself to shrink around kind of a set point. And so an example of a regulating feedback might be the way your body regulates temperature to around 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. If your body happens to get slightly higher than that, it kicks off a process that leaves itself down. Maybe if your body gets cooler than that, it kicks off a process like shivering, causing your body to warm up. If it actually hits 98.6, it doesn't do anything. And so that's an example of a negative feedback where the difference from the set point is constantly being worked on to get smaller and smaller and smaller. So positive and negative feedback are not good and bad. Positive doesn't mean good, negative doesn't mean bad. In fact, very often negative regulating feedback is good. You know, like if we talk about, we're trying to regulate human activity for an resource. Successful, then we hopefully can bring the human activity to a point where it makes for sustainable exploitation of that resource. Or if your temperature control, actually the guy that walked by that was waving his hands around that is world's expert on thermoregulation, actually, strangely enough. And that's an example where if the negative feedback is working properly, your systems, sit at the right temperature. So negative feedback is often good, and positive feedback is sometimes good or sometimes bad. It kind of depends. That's why there's sort of vicious or virtuous. So when we talk about negative and positive feedback, think about it, it's about okay. It's not about good or bad. Technically, both could be good or bad. So are there any questions about this? We're going to see examples of this as we start drawing loops and we see these loops come up, and I think it'll become more clear. But I just want to make sure we got the language in play here, or at least you buy that good is not positive and bad is not negative when it comes to these things. Okay. All right. All right, so before we can get the loops, we have to focus on links in a causal loop diagram. So I should mention that causal loop diagrams won't always have loops. These are diagrams that help us find loops. They don't necessarily have loops in them. You might draw the whole thing, there'll be no loops, and that's fine. It's still a causal loop diagram. So it's a way to find causal loops. In order to find causal loops, you have to start with the links. And so causal loop diagrams always will have links, and those links will always be labeled positive or negative. And so the arrows here are the links. You have a variable, in this case called A, but this could be like hunger. And then you B, which is another, which could be like, amount eaten. And so in this case, if I'm the more hungry I am, the more I eat. And so that is a positive relationship. So the idea here is if you leave the two things, an increase in A causes an increase in B, and likewise a decrease in X causes a decrease in Y. But I think the point I'm trying to get to here, it's relative to sort of some baseline. So if you imagine the system sitting there, you have to imagine what would happen if I perturbed the system. So Ted or Dr. Pat at his current hunger level, if I made him slightly more hungry or slightly less hungry, what would happen to the amount he's eating? So I might already be eating something. And so the question is the amount that I'm eating going to go up or down? Is it going to go in the same direction or the opposite direction? If it goes in the same direction, we call that a positive causal link. If it goes in the opposite direction, we call that a negative causal link. And that's the reason why some authors don't use a plus, they use S for same. And some authors don't use a minus, they use O for opposite. So in your mind, when trying to figure out which one's which, you play a hypothetical game where you're going to say, imagine the system sitting there in its current state. If I decrease this, what happens over here? Am I going to see a decrease or an increase? And if whatever you did here, if it's the same thing happens here, you put a plus, or if whatever you did here, the opposite thing happens here, you put a minus. And that's the difference between a positive link and a negative link. All right, so questions about that so far? And these are causal links, not correlational. So you have to have a plausible causal mechanism that would connect A to B. There can be correlations all over the place, but if you can't directly, this is the direct influence of A on B. And we'll see some examples of that here in a minute. So if I expand this and I think of these 4 variables together, in order for me to figure out what these signs are, this is really a tricky thing. I have to hold all of the other variables constant while I make my hypothetical perturbation, even if in real life it would be impossible to make that little perturbation into one variable without other variables changing too. So for example, I don't know what C's influence on X is. So if C is hunger and X is amount eaten, that's what I mean by C and X. So I imagine, what if I increase C? Now, in your head, you might realize there is a link between C and B. So that if I increase C, it's going to cause B to increase, which is going to have some impact on X. You have to forget that. Now to say just locally, if I manage to somehow increase C, what would that effect alone do on X? This is in mathematics what we refer to as the partial derivative. We're effectively taking the partial derivative of X with respect to C. We need to know the sign of that derivative. And so even though there might be some indirect path where increasing C causes B to increase, which might cause X to decrease, I need to say, if somehow I could manage to hold constant, what would C alone do to X? And it might be there's no direct link, in which case I get rid of this link and there would only be the link up to B and over to X. But a lot of times you'll have indirect links where there's a path from C to X, but there'll be a more direct path from C to X as well. And it's those direct paths. So to try to think about how can I manage to hold everything else constant? And then if I were to manage to, even if C and B are related, if I could manage to increase C alone, what would happen hypothetically to X, given that B stayed the same? Does that make sense? Okay, because we're going to let the computer tool do the complicated stuff of figuring out all the indirect relationships. But in order for the computer tool to figure out the indirect stuff, we have to give it all the direct stuff. All right, so that's what I'm saying, of only C. The other thing that we're going to see in these diagrams are delays. Now, delays have quantitative meaning when we start simulating things in stock and flow diagrams. Here, they just have, they're just communicating that the delay exists. And so we often use these double bars, which comes from thinking of in electronics, capacitors create a lag in systems. And so a lot of times they draw them with kind of a capacitor symbol here, or just the word delay is common here. So both of these things mean the same thing here. And so these two diagrams mean that there is a positive relationship between the flow of hot water and water temperature, say in a shower, but that relationship is only realized after a delay. And so the idea here is if I were to increase the flow of hot water, there will eventually be an increase in temperature, but it may not be immediate. And so that delay is recorded there. Now, nothing is instantaneous. Nothing can move faster than the speed of light. So there always are delays. And so we have to decide when is there a significant delay. And what we sort of mean by that is like relative to all other causal relationships in the system, is this slower than all the other ones? And if you think about where this is going with a shower, you have a very fast response. If you're in a shower, you can feel the water temperature very quickly, and you can very quickly adjust the flow of hot water. But the plumbing behind the wall may not be able to have an impact on the water temperature as quickly. And so your control action may be way faster than the actual actuation that goes on up here. And that's going to create interesting dynamics, because you're going to say, wow, I turned it up, but it's still cold. So I'll turn it up much more. And then a few seconds later, it'll be scalding hot. So then you'll turn it down way too much, and then it'll be freezing cold. And you're doing the right thing. You're moving in the right direction. That you're moving is being affected by the fact that this link is much slower than the other links that are not drawn here, which represent how you are changing the flow of hot water in response to water temperatures. So when there are links that are substantially slower than other links, that's when we throw in these delays. Are there questions about that? Is that pretty clear what I mean by causal delays? Like, I don't know if I've told this story, but they've done studies that say that whenever a professor asks a question, there is a certain about 30-second pause before the generation of the first question. So the professor says, are there any questions? There's about 30 seconds. I mean, there's a distribution, but pretty much you almost never get a question before like something like 30 seconds. And so good pedagogical practice is when you ask a question, you're supposed to kill about 30 seconds of time in order to compensate for that delay. And that's just what I did right now. So okay. All right, so now that's all we need to know for links, positive, negative, delay. The delay doesn't affect how we think about positive or negative. That gets a little bit more complicated and once we get into the sort of stock and flow diagram. So for now, if you see a delay, it's just informational. It's not going to affect how we interpret the loop for now. Now we have enough to then start identifying loops. So a loop in a causal loop diagram is just a path that starts in a variable and ends back on that variable. So this is a loop, a feedback loop, because you can start on any one of these variables, A, and come back to A, B, come back to B, C, come back to C. Now, each one of these links will be labeled positive or negative. The way we figure out if this is a positive feedback or a negative feedback is we count the number of negatives. And if it's an odd number of negatives, then it's a negative feedback loop. If it's an even number of negatives, it's a positive feedback loop. And we'll see an explanation for that in just about a slide. So this example here is that down here, and we labeled them, this is a negative feedback loop. Notice it's because it has one negative feedback, an odd number. This is a positive feedback loop because it has two negative feedbacks, an even number. And as we'll see here in the next slide, this positive feedback loop is positive because the negative action is sort of double negative, it's undone by the other negative action. That's the reason why the even number will lead to positive and the odd number will lead to negative. So that's the rule that you should remember here, is that once you find a loop, count the number of negatives. It's only many positives, it doesn't matter how many positives, but count the number of negatives. If it's an odd number, then it's a negative feedback. If it's an even number, it's a positive feedback. And if we want to see the reason for that, we can imagine unrolling one of these loops. And so I just unrolled this loop. So starts on A, ends on A. So imagine a linear causation here that starts on A and ends on A in the future. And if I think about it that way, then I can see that A has a positive impact on B, B has a positive impact on C, C has a negative impact on future A. The idea here is that if you increase A, it's going to increase B. That increase in B is going to lead to an increase in C. That increase in C is going to lead to a decrease in future A. So the net effect of that is A has a negative impact on itself. So if I think about it then, so where does the double negative come into play? Well, if I had 2 or 4 or 6 or 8 or 0 negatives in this, the net effect when you come back to any variable will end up being a positive effect. And so the even number of negatives in one of these unwrapped paths, then every variable has a positive effect on itself. If you have an odd number of negatives in one of these paths, every variable has a negative effect on itself. So it's what direction do you get when you manage to go all the way back to yourself? And that's where this even odd thing comes into play. Questions about that? Is that pretty clear? The counting of the negatives. Again, this might be something that you already caught. If you, for those of you who took 220, this might be a lot of overlap with that. Sometimes when we get into the counting of things, then this starts to diverge a little bit, but that's the rule that we learned here. Okay. All right, so the other graphical element that we'll see on causal feedback loops are, and this is totally optional, but annotations that, and sometimes you won't even see them in all of the loops, but Moorcroft likes to do them. And they're generally good practice where if, because we know that feedback loops are really driving all the interesting dynamics, once you've identified feedback, you've identified their polarity, positive, negative, balancing, reinforcing, etc. Then if you can sort of say, what's going on in this feedback loop? It's a nice little comment to name it, like hunger amount eaten, so just label it, control of food intake. Up here, there's the shower temperature example. So they've got, flow of actual water temperature, temperature gap, and flow of hot water and that delay. And they said comfort seeking loop. Then down here, they've got a more social example, drug-related crime, call for police action, drug seizures, and price. And this is a crime spiral. So, so you sort of labeled it as gives you some context for what are the outcomes of this process that you see. And that's a regulating feedback, a negative feedback. I'm sorry, that's reinforcing feedback, that's a positive feedback. There's a balancing, and there's another balancing. So this reinforcing feedback is an interesting one, this crime spiral, because it has a bunch of apparently regulating actions. So it's got drug-related crime, creates a call for police action, which increases drug seizures. Drug seizures ends up reducing supply. But the kicker is, you take drugs off the street, it increases the price of the drugs that remain on the street, which in this theoretical model might increase drug-related crime or cause other, members who maybe weren't taken off the street to come back in. So in this case, because of the double negative, this provides a theoretical background for how simply taking drugs off the street may not actually reduce the amount of drug-related crime, because the double negatives cause that with the decrease in supply is just going to increase price. So you end up where this thing just keeps going around. So not saying that's actually what happens or not, but that's the theory, and that's communicated here by the double negatives in this reinforcing feedback loop. Okay. So any questions about what I mean by this? The annotations really don't add any dynamics or anything. In fact, I'll just put up the question slide. Any questions in general? We got positive links, we got negative links. We've got delays, we got positive loops, which are an even number of negative links. We got negative loops, which are an odd number of negative of links. Yeah. Yes. I'm really glad you asked that question. Let me see if I can zoom in on that part, just to make that a little bit more obvious. I don't know if it's going to, let's try this. And maybe I'll share. All right, so let me see if I can zoom in just a little bit on that loop right there. So yeah, so it's really a good question here about this flow of cold water on the outside and desired temperature on the outside. So this is an example where things that don't participate in the loop don't actually play a role in the don't actually play a role in the assigning of to the loop. So there is outside here, there's a flow of cold water that's going into actual water temperature. So the idea here is that if the, oh, sorry, trying to get extra things off. Let's just do this. Well, that's, I guess, big enough. So the idea here is that if you increase the flow of cold water, so imagine you've got this is an older shower where things aren't combined, where you got a separate cold and hot water. And so all you're doing is controlling the hot water, but you just set the cold water at a fixed point. If you increase the flow of cold water, it would decrease the actual water temperature. But we're assuming that the person in the shower is only using the flow of hot water as their regulating feedback. So that's why this feedback loop only involves the flow of hot water. So this flow of cold water does have an impact on one of the variables, but it doesn't matter whether this impact is positive or negative. The loop itself has the same, particularly the desired temperature. I could increase the desired temperature and that would affect the temperature gap. So if I really wanted it to be hotter, then it might take, I might set the flow of hot water higher, but once I've set my desired temperature hotter or colder, the actual feedback that's going on in here doesn't actually, isn't affected by the temperature that I've set. So these sort of hangers on here, they haven't, they're important. We need to include them when we need to simulate the whole system, but they don't change the nature of the feedback because the feedback itself only involves these three variables: the actual water temperature, the gap between desired and actual, and the flow of hot water. So when you're looking for loops, and we'll see examples of this in a second, there's going to be these, it's going to be tricky because you'll have a bunch of things hanging on, but just because they're participating with the variables, they're not going to affect the nature of the feedback themselves unless there's other feedbacks to create other loops. But in this case, we're sort of assuming there's an exogenous parameter, desired temperature, and then an exogenous parameter, flow of cold water, that are just set, and they're not participating in the feedback. They're just set initially, and the feedback is only these three variables. Does that make sense? Great question, because that definitely comes up. Any other questions about this or other? All right, let me go back to the, okay, good. All right, so let's do some practice of these things. So here's an example of a home heating system. We'll see if I can manage to pull this away. Oh, okay, well, I'll just leave it. So I've got a home heating system here. All of these have been labeled. Let's see if we understand what's going on here. So there are two feedback loops here that have to do with the stuff going on inside the house and the stuff that's going outside the house. So the idea here is that there is a certain air temperature inside the house, and there's an outdoor temperature outside the house, and there's a target temperature inside the house. So if we look on this loop, we can compare the air temperature inside the house to target temperature, and that creates, that interacts with the furnace to produce heat. So this is in an area, a part of the world that actually gets cold. So in this case, we're imagining that if the air temperature is lower than the thermostat temperature, then we produce heat that gets dumped into the house. Now that heat is going to increase the energy content in British thermal units inside the house, which as it, that's heating up the air in the house, and that will eventually cause the temperature to increase, leading to a decrease in this gap. And so the furnace will eventually turn on. This loop here is a regulating feedback loop, a balancing feedback loop, which is constantly trying to respond to cold air temperature and heat it up to bring it back up to the thermostat's target temperature. So we've got a negative feedback. So increase in air temperature causes a decrease in furnace production. An increase in furnace production causes an increase in energy in the air. An increase in energy in the air causes an increase in the air temperature. So that's why we have one negative loop here. The increase in air temperature is decrease in furnace production. Everything else is positive. So before we go to the other loop, does this loop over here make sense? It's the regulating feedback in the thermostat. All right, now if you look at the other side, it's cold outside. So, so even though the air temperature might be a little colder than what we want it to be inside, it's going to be warmer than the outdoor temperature. So here, as the air temperature, if it's warm inside the house, then you're going to get a larger amount of heat lost through the walls and everything else in this leaky house out to the outside. And that is going to cause a decrease inside the house, which will then cause a decrease in air temperature. So notice how I said this is a positive link here. But the way I said that is I said a loss here causes a loss here. So they went in the same direction. Earlier, I said an increase here causes an increase there. So when you're doing the hypotheticals, you can go both ways. It's about same or opposite. So, so if I lose here, I lose here. That's why that's a plus. If I increase the air temperature here, I increase loss to the outside. That's why that's the plus. If I increase the heat loss outside, I decrease energy inside the house. That's why that's a negative. So that's why that's an opposite there. Or I could have gone the other way. If I decrease the heat loss, then I'm going to increase the energy inside the house relative to my baseline. So that decrease increase is why that's a negative there. So if I look around this, I only have one negative loop, and now I have two negatives next to each other. So I have a negative feedback loop and another negative feedback loop. And these two things, as we're going to see, are going to fight each other. And this is one of the reasons why you're always going to be losing heat to the outside, and the furnace is always going to be turning on. And overall, the air temperature of the house is going to be some tension between the outdoor temperature and the target temperature, and it's going to be regulated. So the air temperature inside the house will be held constant, even though the furnace is going to keep kicking on, and you're going to keep losing heat to the outside. So questions about that causal loop diagram? Do all those links and loops make sense? And we've got those hangers on like we had in that other example too, which are not participating in the feedback loop. All right, another example. So this is used car market, or I guess just any car market here. So we've got an inventory of cars at dealerships. Now, the more inventory you have at dealerships, the lower the price is going to be. So that's an opposite relationship. If I were to increase the inventory, I would decrease the price. If I were to decrease the inventory, I would increase the price. So that has an opposite relationship, which is why that's got a negative there. Now we can break left or right and see what happens. So the market, well, if I increase price, then they're going to make more cars because the more price makes it more attractive to make more cars. If I increase the number of cars being produced, it's going to increase the inventory. And then, like we said, that will eventually lead to a decrease in price. And that's why that one negative link causes this whole thing to be a negative feedback. Now, on the other side of it, if I increase my market price, it's going to decrease how many cars are sold. That's an opposite relationship. That's why that's a negative. Now, if I increase how many cars are sold, that's going to decrease inventory, which is why that's an opposite relationship. And then this observation on the right side here, I have another negative feedback loop, but now it's because it has three negatives. all three links are negative. Because it's an odd number of negatives, it's a negative feedback loop. So any questions about that? Questions online? Okay. Now, both of those examples together, we can look at through a more kind of general framework for perspective here. In both of these examples, the heating system and automobile market, I've got two balancing loops next to each other that are held together by one sort of stable quantity in the middle. So the market price is sort of the stable quantity, or arguably the inventory of cars, either one of these really, is the stable quantity in the middle of the automobile market. And the air temperature, or arguably the energy content in the house, is the stable quantity at the middle of this one. So we got two balancing loops that are responding to a quantity, which is like a rock that's not moving. And so on one side, you've got a perpetually unmet goal. And on the other side, you've got a perpetually unmet goal. And this perpetually unmet goal is what's going to drive activity continuously on both sides. So on this side of it, you effectively get like a figure eight that creates sort of a reinforcing loop. So whatever your goal is here, as you act, it's going to go through the stable quantity here, which if you think about it, it sort of has this like weird figure eight path that leads back to it. And so even though feedback loop is negative here, because of the way this system is structured, that it's almost as if this second feedback loop doubles the number of negative links. And whenever you double the number of negative links, it goes from odd to even. So it's almost as if putting these two negative feedback loops together creates this figure eight effect, where instead of having an odd number of links, the net effect of putting them together is if they have an even number of negative links. So this creates a reinforcing feedback where this thing constantly runs. The furnace is always running. They're always making new cars. Similarly, on the other side of it, same story is going on. You're always losing heat to the outside. You're always selling cars in the market. And so it's kind of, again, like these two negative feedback loops couple to create balancing feedback loops because this tricky stable quantity in the middle that refuses to move, and that creates this sort of tension between these two that creates kind of a reinforcing action. In general, we don't do this figure eight thing when we look at causal loop diagrams, but the escalate, this is something we call an S figure. And so it's always fine to call this a balancing loop and this a balancing loop, but when you combine two balancing loops in this way, you tend to get a new archetype that comes out of that we refer to as escalation. And that escalation creates something that is like having two reinforcing loops that constantly create generating activity on the edges, even though in the middle, there's no activity whatsoever. That's what we call an escalation. And we'll see escalation over and over again. It's a popular archetype that comes up here. And I'm just showing it as here. And so now this is another example of where escalation, we don't want to add any qualitative meaning to it, like is it good or bad? Well, in the case of the house, the escalation behavior is a bad effect because it's an engine of waste. But in the case of the car production, I mean, I guess it depends on maybe your perspective, but you might view it as a good effect because it's an economic engine, which is generating GDP, basically. It's actually generating economic activity continuously. So, and I don't use engine isn't sort of used accidentally here. If you think about the way an engine works, like an internal combustion engine, it's a similar sort of behavior. It's kind of chasing its own tail. And or a Segway, as you're leaning up against it and it runs. It's a similar sort of thing where two processes, the Segway is trying to keep someone upright, but gravity is trying to keep them down. And as an effect, they end up kind of tilting and just running forward. So their angle stays constant, but they're constantly in motion. So, so that's what we mean by an engine. So could be good, could be bad. The dynamics are identical regardless of what the information is. That's what I mean by an escalation loop. All right, so any questions about that, or I guess I can put these back up here. how these are labeled, what we mean. You're not supposed to see yet that this is escalation. This is just something that we're going to see that as we start building these things, we'll find that when we combine balancing feedback loops in this way, we see over and over again this dynamical behavior, that the stuff on the outside is going to grow as if it was a reinforcing, and the stuff in the middle is going to stay steady as if it was a balancing feedback. So it's like you put all the balancing in the middle and ends up creating reinforcing on the edges. And that's just the interaction of feedback loops. All right, questions, comments? Okay. Questions online? All right, great. So quick example here. Got 3 question marks you want to fill out: chickens, eggs, chickens, and the nature of the loop. So if I want to label this question mark up here, do you think this should be a plus or a minus? So what's the relationship, the causal relationship from chickens to eggs? How many people say plus? Online, anybody? How many people say minus? All right, plus. Plus sounds good to me. Let me see if I can manage to draw a little plus here. All right, then what about if we look down here, eggs to chicken? So causal relationship between eggs and chicken. So how many people would say plus there? I will say, yeah, so hens and roosters. So, yes, so, right, we'll say a fraction of them at least are fertilized. So in general, if you increase eggs, increase chicken. So, so how many people say so positive? How many people say negative? All right, so yeah, we go with positive there as well. So I'll put a little positive there. And when we look at this, then we got, do we have an even or odd number of negative links? Well, we have no negative links. So by default, no negative links is even. So based on that, is to say, how many people would say positive loop? How many people would say negative feedback loop? Right, it's a positive feedback loop or a reinforcing feedback loop. So we could put here in the middle plus, and I put it like down here, but I'm just going to write it on the outside. Or we could put an R for reinforcing, that would be fine. So yeah, reinforcing feedback loop, positive feedback loop. Good. All right, little more. So there are 3 feedback loops here. Who can name one of them? So any hand for, can you find the first feedback loop? Yeah.
Like A1, A2.
All right, A1, A2, A3. Let's see. So that is a loop, great. And then if I look there, I got 1 negative, 1 positive, 1 positive. It looks like, yeah, there's only 1 negative there. So I would call that a negative feedback loop. So if I were to put that here, I'll do a little circle saying this loop is negative. Yeah.
A1.
So looks like we got all the way around the perimeter here is another loop. So that's one that is often hard to see, but you got to always look out for those. So A1 to A2 is a positive, another positive to B1, another positive to B2. Then we got our 1 negative. I'm just counting the negatives. So I'm going to hold up a finger, 1 negative, and then to B3, positive to A3, and then another negative back to A1. So I have to remember, where did I start? I think I started A1. So I got 2 negatives going from A1 back to A1 all the way around the outside loop. And so that 2 negatives is a feedback loop. So I am going to draw, and this gets kind of tricky, but I'm going to put in the middle here a loop this way, and I'll put a positive. And it's a little tricky here because this looks like I'm labeling this inner thing, but if I look at the inner thing, there is no loop here. If I go from A2 to B1, it doesn't go down. If I go from A2 to A3, it doesn't go across. So there is no loop in the middle. So an educated reader would hopefully know that this must be outside here. And so that's sometimes commonly done here is when you have the big loops, you got to kind of look for it. There's one other loop. Anybody see it? Yeah. B1, B2, and B3. So I go B1 to B2 was one positive, B2 to B3 was one negative, B3 to B1, one positive. So that right there is a feedback loop that has an odd number of negatives. So I would call that a negative feedback loop. So I can put that up there as well. So I'll just this here and do a negative. Good, so we've got two negative feedback loops that are linked together by a positive feedback loop, and we'll learn that that's also another one of these interesting archetypes. So that's kind of down the stream there. Other things here, I'm not gonna go through, I just wanna sort of point these things out. Good thing for a home is to convince yourself that neither of these are correct. So in this one here, I hope you'll see that it does have a loop, but loop has one negative link, so it's not positive. Over here, it looks like a loop, but if you actually look more closely, there is no loops in this causal loop diagram because C only goes to D. There's no feedback coming back to C, so that should not be there. So that should be a negative, and that should not be there at all. So hopefully you can convince yourself of that. Another one at home, is try to find all the loops in the bird feeder problem that I kind of gave earlier. It's a good exercise. So the last couple of minutes here, I just want to give a couple of rules to focus on here that we'll again in the next couple of lectures and as we see what Moorcroft says here. But something I mentioned earlier is that these causal loop diagrams are meant to cause, they capture theoretical causality, not correlation. So this is kind of an example here where dry, hot summer, sunny weather happens to lead to both an increase in ice cream sales and an increase in sunburn. Now, you can look at that and say, well, maybe ice cream sales are increasing sunburn rate. Now, it is true that those two things are correlated, but they're correlated because they have a common cause, right? Post hoc ergo prop, I don't know, it doesn't matter. But the right way to grab that common cause would be something like this, where I can say the average temperature has an effect on sunburn rates, but also has an effect on ice cream sales, but there's no link between these. You could say maybe people with sunburn tend to eat more ice cream, so maybe there's a link going this way, but for all intents and purposes, for our theoretical model here, we know that there definitely is a link between temperature and these two things. We're asserting a causal hypothesis through here. We're not trying to describe a correlation. So these are causal loop diagrams, not correlational diagrams. Okay. Other things to think about is make sure that your variables are not, or basically are noun phrases. So in this example here, it's got costs rise, prices rise. This is a little confusing because it's hard to say what would happen if we had an increase in costs rise, and how would that affect prices rise. So instead we say, well, just get rid of the verbs and say the right way to do that would say, how do costs affect prices? And as costs increase, we get an increase in price. So stick to noun phrases. Have a clear sense of direction. Don't say feedback from boss and mental attitude. We don't know what type of feedback it is. We don't know what type of mental attitude it is. Positive feedback, praise from boss, and morale. Those two things have clear senses of direction, so it's clear how that you're supposed to draw this arrow. And the other thing is that the normal sense of direction, this is a little bit of a convention. It's not going to kill you if you break this one, but it's just conventional to try to make the normal sense of direction positive. So instead of saying costs, an increase in costs leads to an increase in losses, you could say, well, why don't we just say an increase in costs leads to a decrease in profits? So rather than putting a negative connotation into the variable name, put the negatives into the links themselves. So we want to try to make the normal sense of direction, whatever that means, to try to be positive. So we focus not on the loss of profits, and then we focus on negative relationships with the profits instead of the loss. And I think that's kind of the big thing. So any questions about these 3 rules, which we'll see again as we move forward? All right. So just reminders that for lecture B2 coming up, we're going to learn how to start drawing these things in VinSim or Insight Maker. So if you want to bring your own laptop and have VinSim installed, that's great. I was told that VinSim got installed on these computers late last week. I was going to double check that today to make sure that if it's not installed on these computers, then we have Insight Maker. They both can do the causal diagrams. But if you want your own laptop, that's good too. Otherwise, Muddy's Point coming up for Sunday, and for next week, lecture B3, that's Tuesday. That's Moorcoff's chapter on causal loop stuff. So make sure to maybe look for reading for that. And so yeah, that's just the standard reading stuff. So with that, let me give you an attendance question, and happy to take any remaining questions if you got them. So the question I'll ask you is, give me a number of negative links that would correspond to a negative feedback loop. So if I had a negative feedback loop that had that many links, then it would be a negative feedback loop. So I'm looking for 1, 2, 3, 4, just pick a number. And that number is going to be a number representing a negative feedback loop. So how many negative links do I need to get? Just give me an example, a number. A number is what I'm looking for. Any example number that would correspond to a negative feedback loop, number of negative links. So give an example of the number of negative links in a negative feedback loop. And that's all I've got for you. So if you have any questions, feel free to come up after. Otherwise, we'll see you Thursday. We'll start open up software tools. Any questions remaining online? Hopefully the audio will clear as I start speaking up. If not, I will go ahead and end the meeting.